Welcome back to the forecast brought to you by Headstorm, the show that teaches you how to engineer growth by learning from industry luminaries to provide you with tactical steps you can use tomorrow. Hi, I'm Julian Placino, host of Headstorm Forecast. In today's forecast, we're joined by Vonnie Estes. Vonnie is the Vice President of Innovation with the International Fresh Produce Association. Today, she's talking about sustainability in agriculture. She's also going to share her take on climate change, population bursts, health issues, and a broad spectrum of topics. Vonnie, it's an honor. Let's get started.
Before we sort of jump into the weeds here and kind of talk about the things that you have to deal with on a daily basis, I wanted to start with you educating our audience, or perhaps enlightening them about how exactly do you define sustainability, particularly through the lens of fresh produce?
Yeah, it's like any complex idea. It's got a million different definitions that we're all trying to deal with. The USDA has about a 10-page definition of sustainability. You look at a lot of investment companies, they have their own definition of sustainability. But I kind of look at a broad definition that it's practices that allow us to be in business today without destroying the environment for tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a broad definition that can be taken in a lot of different directions. Another frame that I use that's really helpful is the 3 E's: environment, economics, and equity. And environment is the area that I've spent a lot of my career working on, which is looking at how do we grow healthier food for a healthier planet. And so that's an area I've spent a lot of time on. On the economics piece, you have to do this in a way that makes money throughout the whole chain, or people won't do it. Mm-hmm. So somehow that has to be funded. The equity piece is an interesting new area. I think in the last couple of years, we've all become a lot more aware of really looking at, in this idea of sustainability, how do we make sure that we're taking care of people and that we're taking care of people's health and that we're paying them in an equitable way. So that's kind of one way to frame sustainability that makes sense overall. I think if you look at produce is different than a lot of other areas of agriculture for a number of different reasons. When you think about growing corn, you think about acres and acres of kind of the same thing, and you may have one person driving a tractor. So a big difference in produce is that when you think about a field of strawberries, you think about dozens of people out in that field picking those strawberries. So a big difference in looking at sustainability and around the equity piece and how we treat workers is labor is a huge difference. Yep. And then another big difference is around packaging, as you mentioned in your introduction. We use a lot of plastic in produce, and we use a lot of plastic because plastic works really well to keep food fresh. So if you didn't have plastic around that greenhouse cucumber, it would rot. If you didn't have plastic protecting things, they would get banged up. So plastic works really well, but we use a lot of plastic. And so that's an area from a sustainability impact that we really need to think more about. How can we use less plastic in that area to be more sustainable? Another area that's different in produce is that we have to deal with a cold chain. We have to keep this product cold or it can go to waste. When you think about corn or the cereals, you put it in a silo, it stays in the silo, and you can move it around, it's dry, it stores. We have to really make sure that we have things in a cold chain so that they don't rot, and that they arrive at the consumer or at the grocery store in a way that people can consume them. So there's a lot of things that are the same with produce and row crops, but these are some of the main differences.
Yeah, that sort of adds on to the complexities that we kind of went through, and it creates sort of an ecosystem where the number of options and the number of levers that you have to pull become very limited, and you have to be very strategic in the way you sort of think about things and what levers to pull, and in perhaps in what sequence to pull them in. So with that sort of context and background that you've established, why sustainability now? I mean, we've gone through bursts of population growth over many decades, and our food system has taken a bit of a beating, but it's managed. It's straggled along for a little bit now. So why is it important to think about it now?
Well, I think one thing, as you said, our food system is amazingly resilient. And I think if you think about, what happened all the way through COVID, there was some real hiccups in the supply chain, especially in the beginning. But pretty much you could get what you wanted on your plate, at least in the US and most countries, you could get what you wanted. You could still get the food that you wanted. So think about the resilience of that, given what was happening in the rest of the world. So the food supply chain is resilient. But why do we need to really pay more attention to sustainability now? And one reason is it's what consumers want. Consumers are asking for it. So retailers are asking for it. And PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, did a survey recently that about half of the people that they surveyed said that they would rather buy food that they knew was produced in a sustainable way. Now, there's always a question of will they pay more for it, but that they come to the store thinking, I want to buy food where I kind of know about the food that I'm buying. So that's one reason that there's going to be a drive from consumers and retailers to do it that way. Another thing is climate change, and we're starting kind of climate change in both directions. Food production has a huge impact on increasing climate change. So we really need to look at practices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to focus on carbon sequestration. So there's how do we reduce climate change, but then there's also how do we react to climate change? So we're having higher temperatures, lower temperatures, more rain, less rain, storms. We're having all these things that are happening in our weather systems where we're growing crops outside. And so we really have to respond to how do we grow differently? How do we grow in a more sustainable way that we're going to be able to continue to grow in these areas as the climate continues to change?
Yep. And I think one of the things that I've come across in the conversations that we've been having around sustainability is just the sheer awareness part. I think what a lot of times people forget is, just because it worked 40 years ago doesn't mean it will work today, and also doesn't necessarily mean because it worked 40 years ago that it is good now.
What worked before doesn't necessarily mean it will work today. It's not just what our environment needs, but what our consumers demand. Today, our target audience is more conscientious. A huge emotional connector, a huge focus for them is the idea that they are contributing to a better tomorrow. That's why the idea of sustainability and all it entails is pivotal. Our consumers are reading the back of packages, and some aren't liking what they see. Let's dive into our next segment as we address today's mindset, how tech adoption is helping folks out, and why collaborating systems are the way of the future.
And when we talk about the technology adoption piece, for our end users, do you feel that it's more, you sort of mentioned it earlier on where you talked about, hey, the technology itself needs to be approachable. How much of that is sort of played along with the user's mindset with regards to, hey, I'm not sure if this is going to work for me?
Yeah, I think part of it is just return on investment. If I buy something, if it's a piece of equipment or it's a system, what's my return of investment going to be and how long is that going to take? And you have to be able to articulate that pretty clearly to a producer. And if you can't articulate it, you better go back to the drawing board because you don't have a product that's very helpful. So return on investment is a big thing. Another thing that I see, especially with a lot of the data analytics, is that people have legacy systems. They have systems of ways like in a packing house or a warehouse of produce. They have data systems that they've been using. They may be archaic and they may be using spreadsheets and text messages and an Excel spreadsheet, and that may be their system, but they still have a system. And so part of it is being able to articulate, how do you plug into that system and make it easier for them, not harder for them.
Yeah, and I think that you bring up a good point about, when we're sort of approaching technology, be it in the sustainability space or sort of any space, it's not feasible to have sort of this rip and replace mentality. I cannot come in and tell you that, okay, we have a better way to slice bread, so throw away this bread slicer and we'll give you the new bread size slicer and your problem is solved. A lot of companies have made significant investments, not just from a technology perspective, but also from a people and process perspective, where their people understand that process. Sure, it's strung together through text messages and Excel files and manual data entry, but it works for them, and that's kind of what they're good at. Putting in a net new technology on the table from a rip and replace perspective will basically cause a systemic ripple effect that impacts their effectiveness, their productivity, and perhaps even the crop yield. So they're sort of not willing to take that risk. It just becomes even more so it becomes even more riskier for them to do something of that sort. So with that sort of in mind, keeping the incremental pieces and trying to figure out how do you grow your footprint into a particular organization, be it your specific product, be it specific a tool. What are some of the other ways that you feel in your conversations that growers and producers are feeling comfortable, or how can we make them feel comfortable with the adoption of new technology?
Well, I think you mentioned it earlier, just thinking about what problem are you trying to solve. And there's one company I'm working with right now that's in the accelerator that I'm working on. And there's a huge problem around food safety in the produce industry, where there's a lot of protocols, there's a lot of audits, there's a lot of information you have to have ready for the government, and there's testing and things that have to be done. And so it's very regulated, luckily, because we have very safe food. But most of it is done through email, and you've got somebody in your organization that it's their job, but they have another job, and things don't get done and forms don't get filled out. And it's a very difficult thing to manage in a lot of organizations. And so this company that I'm working with, they come in and they look at your whole organization of how you're managing food safety. And they say, give us everything that you're doing. And they just digitize that whole thing. So at the exact right time, a spreadsheet or a form will end up in somebody's mailbox, and they'll say, you have to fill out this form by this date. And if you don't fill it out completely, they said one of the biggest problems with these forms and these audits is people don't, like all of us, we don't fill out every line. And so if you don't fill it out, it doesn't go in, and there's a tracking system. And so I think that type of thing, where you look at, what's the system, if you can go in and digitize that for somebody, it just makes it so much easier. And then and find a way how that connects to the rest of the organization. So I think there's some ways like that where you just have to find these pockets. Another company I talked to, it's a company that grows beans, a grower that grows beans in the field that then goes to the processing plant. And so that can get really messed up. Like if the harvest is going slow, or the plant shuts down, or a truck gets lost, or there's all sorts of things that can happen. But if everybody is tied together on the same software, just like a Teams type of software where everyone's tied together on the same type of software, then that really helps the communication and helps things move more smoothly. So it's not like, let's get rid of everything that you're doing. Let's just improve it and digitize it.
Yeah, no, I love that example, because I actually can relate to it through some of the projects that we did for a retailer. And retailers also go through a significant amount of audit, particularly with their store cleanliness. You talk about the temperatures in the refrigerated and frozen sections, so they have to have regular audits and people checking those temperatures. So we, just as you pointed out, we went in, we digitized sort of the entire process, but then the slow evolution of that would be from it becoming a reactive to more of a proactive system, where, okay, now through sensors in all your refrigerator systems, we can notify you when a temperature falls below a certain threshold, and you can go check on it before that produce goes bad or that product goes bad, versus someone having to every 4 hours or every 8 hours doing those temperature checks. So those are, again, some ways how we continue to slowly evolve technology versus coming in and ripping and replacing your process to, let's go put sensors. Well, I'm not sure how the sensors plug into other things, so no thank you.
Tech adoption is a big deal nowadays, and part of that adoption has to do with collaborative measures, not being isolated by tech, not working in a closed loop system. If everyone is tied together, everyone can work off the same script and promote a singular positive mindset. In the next segment, we'll talk about what it all boils down to and what the consumer looks for when they go to the store.
So with kind of keeping that in mind, we've talked about a broad spectrum of things, and I feel that a lot of times it can get overwhelming for a person who's not so familiar with technology. So how do you think growers and producers or anybody through their supply chain and the value chain that the fresh produce goes through, how should they go about getting started?
Well, I think one of the things is every producer is probably already using a lot of practices that increase their sustainability metrics. And they just don't, that's just normal practice. When you talk to producers about, oh, well, you should care about your soil, they're like, well, of course I care about my soil. And so I think one place to start is just do an audit. There's a number of companies that can help, but just look at what you're already doing. Pat yourself on the back. Tell your story to some people, because everyone is already doing what they know how to do to be more sustainable. So I think that's an important thing, to look at what you're already doing. Look what other people are doing. There's just understanding of other companies like yours. Is a lot being written, what other people are doing, go to conferences, read articles, see what other people are doing. And then I think just pick a couple of things, don't feel like, I think it is a problem. This is, not specific to growers. We all do this. It's like you get so overwhelmed with, how do I change the world? I can't, I'm just going to do nothing. Pick two things, just pick a couple things and start, and really think about what your impact is and what your goals are. So I think there's a lot of information out there now to really think about, what are some specific things that I can do, and keep in mind, you need to have a return investment on these. And so, look for things that you're not spending money, you're actually, they'll help you make money.
Yeah, no, and one of the things that we also encourage, folks that we're talking to, is start small. Don't try to make don't try to boil the entire ocean down. Pick smaller incremental goals to slowly move you in that direction. And sure, it may take you 5 years to get there, it may take you 10 years to get there, but ultimately, as long as you're making those small incremental goals, that sort of feeds off of each other, and has you moving along in the right direction, versus picking up something big and large and getting overwhelmed and confused, and not being able to make the most effective use of your resources, particularly, as you mentioned, the cost piece of it. Like, if I went out there, stuck a bunch of sensors in my farm, and didn't quite understand what am I going to do with that data, or how am I going to use this data, or what decisions is it going to drive, and how does those decisions contribute to some of the financial goals that I have, be it from a revenue perspective or from a cost perspective, that starts to become a very hard argument to have when you're sitting in front of your CFO.
Yeah.
So to close things out, Vonnie, I wanted to sort of give you the opportunity to leave our audience with something that that you felt was a great lesson learned as you came into this industry, and you learned the ins and outs of it, and kind of being, from your vantage point, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit, is what a system it is, what a food system, the whole thing is, all the way from crop inputs to the consumer, and that a lot of the issues that we have to look at are really systemic. And I'll tell one short story. When I first entered the produce industry, I'd been working a lot on developing plant breeding and plant traits and some of the very early stuff. And that was like my vision. And the important thing is, like, you have to have the right trait, right? And so I went to this conference, and I heard a bunch of people who were in transportation talk about the lack of truck drivers and the quality of truck drivers at the time. And they said, yeah, we had this whole shipment of tomatoes in a truck, and we had a 19-year-old truck driver, and he pulled the truck over and went in to get lunch and used the restroom and didn't turn the cooler on and came out, and the whole truck was wasted because it was 100 degrees. And I thought all that genetics that went into that truck, and then it was just one 19-year-old that didn't flip the switch. And so it really makes you realize how many steps there are along the way, and how this is a system that needs to be looked at as an entire system. And from a sustainability point of view, it's really important to look at all the different points. You know, you may be doing something that's more sustainable for you, like leaving the plastic off a tomato, or off a cucumber, but then it rots before it gets to the store. So that really wasn't a sustainable choice. And so I think just looking at the whole food system as a system, and how do we solve some problems that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there's a certain bit of perception that goes into it. You know, in terms of when you go out in the grocery store and you see a fruit or a produce that's bruised, you don't necessarily pick that one up. You sort of dig for the greenest, the freshest, and you put that into your cart. And all the ones that are minorly bruised, I'm sure that, you know, through the supply chain, you try to avoid as much as you can. But we kind of also have to change that mindset that it is okay if your apple has a tiny little bruise. It's okay if your bananas don't look, you know, yellow all the way and they've got, you know, small speckles on it. I think that also needs to be addressed through some sort of perception.
Tech and its adoption can be overwhelming. There's simply so much tech out there. Nevertheless, it's critical to start jumping onto the bandwagon. Dip your toes in. Don't start with some big initiative. Just pick a sustainable objective and take small steps towards it. It will be worth your time. The Forecast's next segment will give you the inside scoop on carbon credit markets.
What other revenue streams do farmers have to really maximize their profit? Well, they can get involved in carbon credit marketplaces. In certain areas of the world, they have the certified emission reduction markets. These are something that was created by governments, they're regulated by the government, and the largest in the world is currently the European Union's emissions trading scheme, and that's about 80% of the market. And it's great for governments because they can raise money. So they really like to use these because they can just get taxes out of it, but it also has a benefit for the environment. Another type of market is the voluntary emissions reduction markets, and these are bigger in the United States right now because we don't have an overall plan for, well, we have plans to introduce some certified emission reduction markets in the US, but nothing's really in place right now. But what we do have are these voluntary ones, and they're created with industry standards. Many of them are blockchain based. They're trying to solve for the issues of double spending of credits, just not keeping good tallies. There are lots of issues in these markets with just keeping their data straight. So some of them have moved to the blockchain, which is just one way to solve for that. They're smaller, but by purchasing these credits, you can have a positive impact on the environment, and you can brag about it if you're a company too. So you'll see that. The other cool thing is that anybody can buy them. If you want to go to Cool Effect right now, you could offset your entire year of carbon just for $250 if you wanted to do that. So what is a carbon credit? It's a permit that allows a company to emit carbon up to a certain amount. That's all that it is. But how does it work? In the CER marketplaces, which are set by the government, they will put a cap on the amount of emissions that can be emitted for the entire industry. They'll regulate certain types of businesses and put a cap on them. So the businesses are either given or need to purchase carbon credits, and over time the number of credits that are allowed into this marketplace reduce because we're trying to reduce emissions. So over time they're going to need to invest in lowering their emissions, or else their costs will go up because they're going to have to pay to purchase other credits or to pay an additional tax, whatever the market is requiring for them to do. So if they're not able to meet their limit, they can purchase carbon credits for other companies or purchase carbon reduction credits from carbon reduction projects. And carbon reduction projects, they earn carbon offsetting credits by reducing greenhouse gases. So a carbon offset credit is generated by a carbon reducing project, and they can be purchased by emitters to increase their credit allowance, once again for goodwill and marketing. And there are a few different types of these credits, and they can be generated from a different variety of activities. The reduction offset credit is good. It is generated when you reduce your energy use or reduce fertilizers. The avoidance offset is another type, which is a little bit better. You can gain these from avoiding deforestation of agricultural land or using renewable energy. And the removal offset is all about actually taking that carbon in the atmosphere and storing it somewhere in ground or in the trees. And this is going to take the longest amount of time to have an impact, but it is really the most impactful overall. So we really need to get that carbon out of the air in order to reverse climate change.
Thanks as always for tuning in to the forecast brought to you by Headstorm with your hosts, myself, Julian Placino, and Nitin Bhatia. As part of this vast community, we hope these tips and insights will make a difference, future-proof your business, your mindset, and help you surpass your expectations. Feel free to reach out. Our contact info is in the description. Hope to see you next time as the forecast brings you more thoughts from industry leaders and strategies to engineer growth.